Hugh Hewitt live from Studio Beltway, back inside the Beltway, as is Mollie Hemingway. You can follow Mollie on Twitter at MZ Hemingway. Good morning, Mollie.
Great to be here with you.
Thank you. Now, Mollie, you work for Fox. I'm not going to put you in a corner and ask you to comment on what happened. Nobody really knows what happened with Tucker. I do want to know, though, if you can comment. I only know him as a green room friend. His father was instrumental in the start of my career, absolutely central to the start of my career. So I've known Tucker forever, and he's been just a nice acquaintance. And I'm charmed by the number of people who are telling Tucker stories online today about how kind and generous he is. You think that's off-brand for Tucker and he resents it because he's just a very nice guy?
Oh, no, you're hearing those stories because they're absolutely true. I mean, people think of him as an important figure and spokesperson for a big part of the country, but he's also just an incredibly nice guy. And I know many people who have benefited from that kindness. Just even like he's widely read, and so journalists who would write something occasionally would get a nice comment from him. And he's actually a really good writer himself. So he'd take time to tell low-level journalists that he thought they'd done a good job with the piece. I guess it's a little different than the persona, but it's definitely real.
Yeah, it is. Now, I want to talk to you about the one speculative, or that's actually two speculations I made. One, he's a Mainer. If he wanted to, he could run against Angus King, who's very popular in Maine, but he's 80 years old. And all of Maine north of the Harrisicot is completely red. And in Portland and south, it's deep blue until you get near the New Hampshire border. So that's speculation number one. If he wanted to, he can run for Senate. Number two, and this is from Twitter this morning, the Great Mentioner's long list of possible Trump vice presidential nominees will include not only the standard, Governor DeSantis and Nikki Haley and Tim Scott, but also people like Mike Pompeo, Ambassador O'Brien, Rick Grinnell, Tom Cotton, Mike Gallagher. It'll also have Tucker on there because that's the doubling down that Al Gore served for Bill Clinton. What do you think about that? That would be a very Trumpian move.
Yeah, I hadn't really thought about it at all. I definitely talked to a lot of people who wish that he would run for office in some way. And I hadn't really even thought about the vice presidential angle. I guess it's a possibility. I learned one thing in 2016, which is never to think that you know how to predict how things will go. And so certainly there'd be a market for it at the very least. I don't know if he would want to do that.
Now, I bring it up because this morning in the Biden re-announcement video, Kamala Harris features prominently in there. That just kills all speculation she's going to be dumped. So they're stuck with her. But she does do one thing. She can go around the country and raise money for your campaign. If you name your vice president early, you can dispatch them out. And Donald Trump broke precedent when he named his Supreme Court list early. Think he will name a vice president early if it helps him. Richard Schweiker, I've been reading the Richard Norton Smith biography of Gerald Ford, and I'd forgotten that Reagan picked Richard Schweiker in 1976 as his last-ditch Hail Mary in the battle for delegates. What do you think about picking somebody early? Just break and name your whole cabinet early, no matter who the Republican is.
I love the reference to the judge list because that ended up being so important for Donald Trump's 2016 campaign. I think something like 25% of Republican voters said that they voted for him precisely because he had done this with the list of potential justices. And so that created a totally different paradigm for Republican voters where they realized they could sort of demand things of their candidates. And particularly on the cabinet level, I like the idea of coming up with a list of who you'd choose from so that you get the idea of what type of people you're going to have. I think Trump had tried to do a blended cabinet where you had a lot of establishment figures more than the people that had brought him to power. So maybe naming whether he would do that again or whether he would have people who wanted to get more done. That would be really interesting. But I don't know how effective it is to name a VP early. I know, again, who knows? You don't predict anything from after we lived through 2016. But it always seems kind of like a weak move to pick your VP before, too early, almost like desperate. So I don't know.
Now, one thing I want to note. Mitch McConnell, though he is not Donald Trump's favorite, got Donald Trump elected by holding open the Scalia vacancy created by the Supreme Court justice's untimely death. And that created an issue, and Donald Trump seized the issue. If he put out a list of possible VPs, it would also help you vet. Because what people didn't understand when Steve Schmidt and Nicole Wallace came up with Sarah Palin. I like Governor Palin, but they didn't understand that there were downsides there because she was so out of left field. The only person I'd ever heard talk about her was Michael Medved. And I thought that's just not going to happen. Alaska, it doesn't. And of course, you never know what's going on. But when it's done in secret, you open yourself up to wild swing. It's like when Stuart Stevens didn't let anyone see the draft of Mitt Romney's acceptance speech. No one was able to say to him, why don't you mention the American military in this? We're in a war. And I mean, just if you stay in a closed room, you only get the views that are in the room, Molly.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. Although John McCain was kind of dead in the water until he picked Sarah Palin, so I'm not sure how bad that pick was, even if, with Steve Schmidt and Nicole Wallace, you mentioned, ended up kind of sabotaging her from the inside on that. But, the more outside, and I actually think, the 2016 campaign with Trump was chaotic. It was a mess. You had people yelling at each other, but it actually produced a really good campaign with vibrant ideas. The 2020 campaign was more shut down. It was more orderly. Everyone kind of agreed on the campaign team, and then they would present issues to President Trump. I think that there's something to be said for having just that chaos and yelling at each other, even in the same way that the 2016 primary, which seemed like a mess because you had all these people up on the stage, actually let people litigate issues, discuss issues, think about what they wanted. Whereas, again, in 2020, there was no competition. And so there was no debate over what people wanted. I like the idea of opening up the room, having people just yell at each other about what they want, and you get a better result. I agree.
Now, Molly, the last thing that matters in America is whether or not media personalities have a favorite. I don't. I'm in Switzerland. I assume you are as well. But I also don't think the polls about Donald Trump being unbeatable so far ahead make a bit of difference at this point. I think anyone can win this thing because, again, reviewing the 1976 race, the 1980 race, everything is open until it's closed. Do you agree with me on that? We just don't know what if China attacks Taiwan in the next year, which would make sense given that Joe Biden is the weak, feckless president that we've got and wouldn't do anything. What do you think is the volatility index on this race?
Well, it would. I think it might require a lot of external influence to change things up fundamentally, but that's totally a possibility. And, people, I hear, obviously Donald Trump is doing extremely well in the polls, and when it comes to voting, that seems like it would help him a lot. But I hear people saying that Ron DeSantis is too far behind. He's actually doing really well as well. He's not even running for president, and he has a huge percentage of the Republican Party saying that they would like him, and you've got him as the sort of number 2 option for most Trump voters and vice versa. I don't know about the rest of I don't think Asa Hutchinson has a huge shot here, but with 60, 70, 80% of the Republican Party behind either Trump or DeSantis, I think that gives a good idea of the direction the party wants to go, but it's not a done deal by any stretch of the imagination.
And Molly, I have been doing a deep dive in the New Hampshire primary over the years. over 40 years. It's very hard to predict what they're going to do. Chris Sununu is a factor in this race as well. The governor of New Hampshire is a center-right Republican, not a conservative in the traditional sense. Do you think New Hampshire will play as big a role as it traditionally has? And it is true. No Republican has ever won the White House without winning New Hampshire first.
Yeah, it's an important state to win, but again, I don't know how much campaigning we're seeing there yet, so it's hard to know how it would go. And these are such weird times, but there's a reason why people focus on that state. It's important.
Yeah. Last question: Bud Light sales down 17%. I'm asking all my guests today, what is the takeaway you have from that number?
It's remarkable to me how much this organic boycott has had an effect on Anheuser-Busch, and hopefully that does send a message to other companies about just being, enslaved to leftist wokeism. But I do think also the right needs to know how to do some more organized demands too. Yes, it's good that the sales are down in terms of accomplishing goals for the right, and it's good that they put that VP on leave. But when the left makes demands of corporations, they get millions or even billions of dollars in sort of reparation type response. They get positions on boards. They get their own people in the company. We've seen nothing like that yet. So I think if Anheuser-Busch was serious, maybe they should start treating conservatives like they treat the left.
Interesting. Hadn't thought about that, Molly. I just thought it was sort of a Chick-fil-A. You used the term organic. That's exactly what it is. When Chick-fil-A was under attack, an organic rally around them occurred, and this was an organic, put that away. We're not getting into a political debate here when I'm drinking a beer. Mollie Hemingway on Twitter, MZ Hemingway. See her on Fox. Come right back.